Hey everyone. We all think we know what it takes to look good, but the Renaissance was a whole different game. Today, we've got safety labs and scientists making sure our makeup won't kill us. Back then, people just guessed and hoped for the best. It was a total mess. We're talking about people washing their faces with actual urine just to get a clear complexion. They'd pluck their hairlines back until they started bleeding, all because a giant forehead was the height of fashion. And for foundation, they used literal poison. They smeared white lead on their skin and just ignored the fact that it was rotting their guts. I'm just a guy reading stories, so subscribe if you want to stay for the ride. Also, where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. Let's see how this actually happened. So, look, we have to start with a basic truth about the 1500s. People back then weren't just obsessed with their looks because they were shallow or had too much time on their hands. They were obsessed because looking rich was the only way to stay safe. If you lived back then, your face was your resume, your bank statement, and your ID card all rolled into one. And the one thing you absolutely could not be was tan. Today, we spend billions of dollars on tanning beds and bronzers. We want that just got back from the beach look. But in the Renaissance, a tan was the ultimate red flag. If your skin was dark or leathery, everyone knew exactly who you were. You were the guy in the field. You were the girl picking weeds under the scorching sun for 12 hours a day. You were a peasant. And being a peasant sucked. You had no rights, you had no money, and you had zero respect. If you wanted to be anyone of importance, you had to be pale. I'm talking ghostly, sickly white. If you stayed inside all day, it meant you didn't have to work. It meant you had servants to do the hard stuff for you. Pale skin was a loud, clear signal that said you had money. It was the Rolex or the private jet of the 1500s. If you looked like you'd never seen a ray of sun in your life, you were at the top of the food chain. This wasn't just a fashion choice. This was about survival. Think about how we treat people today based on what they wear. Now, imagine that feeling, but cranked up to 100. If you walked into a shop or a party looking like you'd been working in the dirt, people wouldn't even look at you. They'd probably kick you out. But if you showed up with skin like marble, suddenly doors opened. People listened when you spoke. You got better deals, better seats at church, and better protection from the law. The class structure back then was like a brick wall. You were born into a spot, and you spent your whole life fighting not to fall down to a lower one. The easiest way to tell where someone stood was to look at their skin. Social classes weren't just an idea, they were a physical reality you carried on your face. You were either a winner or you were a worker. There was no middle ground. Now, if you were a woman, this pressure was 10 times worse. You weren't just representing yourself. You were a walking billboard for your husband or your father's bank account. If a man had a wife with skin as white as milk, it told the world he was loaded. It meant his wife didn't have to lift a finger. She didn't have to go to the market, she didn't have to tend a garden, and she definitely didn't have to work the land. She sat in a cool, dark room and just looked expensive. It was a high-stakes game. If a woman started to look a little too outdoorsy, it didn't just hurt her reputation. It made the men in her life look like failures. It suggested her husband was going broke and couldn't afford to keep her inside. For a woman, her face was her only real currency. A good marriage was the only way to ensure she wouldn't starve or end up on the streets. If she showed up to a dance with a tan or a few freckles, She was basically telling every rich bachelor in the room that she wasn't worth the investment. She was damaged goods. So women spent their entire lives hiding. They wore massive hats. They stayed behind thick curtains. They did whatever it took to keep that ghostly look. Because if they lost their looks, they lost their security. They lost their home. They lost everything. People spent hours every single morning staring into tiny warped mirrors, checking for any sign of the sun. A single freckle was a disaster. It was a crack in the armor. It meant the sun had found you. This wasn't some peaceful, relaxing beauty routine. It was a frantic, desperate race to stay at the top. They were willing to do anything to maintain that white mask, even if it meant using things that weren't exactly safe. But before they realized the danger, they only saw the reward. They saw a life of luxury, respect, and power. And in the Renaissance, that was worth any price. If you looked poor, you were treated like dirt. If you looked rich, you were a god. And everyone wanted to be a god.
Think about it. If you're trying to look like a god, you need a blueprint. You need someone to show you what a god actually looks like. In the late 1500s, that person was Queen Elizabeth I. She was the ultimate influencer long before that word even existed. She wasn't just a politician or a ruler. She was a brand. And she knew that her face was her most important asset. Every time she stepped out in public, she was sending a message. But in 1562, that brand almost went bankrupt. Elizabeth caught smallpox. Back then, that was usually a death sentence. Her doctors were terrified. Her advisors were losing their minds because if she died, the whole country was in trouble. She eventually pulled through, but when she finally got out of bed and looked in the mirror, she didn't see a queen anymore. She saw a woman with deep red scars and craters all over her skin. The disease had chewed through her face. For a woman whose power depended on looking perfect and untouchable, this was a total disaster. She couldn't show her people a face that looked broken. If she looked weak, her enemies would pounce. So she did what any genius would do. She reinvented herself. She decided she wasn't going to age, at least not in public. She started using this stuff called Venetian ceruse. It was a mix of white lead and vinegar. It was heavy, it was thick, and it was incredibly white. She didn't just dab it on like we do with makeup today. She slathered it on. She used it like spackle. She filled in the holes left by the smallpox until her skin was as smooth and flat as a sheet of paper. This became what history calls the mask of youth. For the next 40 years, she basically refused to age. She wore that white paint every single day. As she got older, she didn't change her look. She just kept adding more layers to hide the wrinkles and the damage the lead was doing to her own skin. Now here's the wild part. Everyone else saw this and went totally crazy for it. They didn't see a sick woman hiding her scars. They saw the most powerful woman on earth looking like a porcelain doll. They thought, if she looks like that, I have to look like that. It didn't matter if you had perfectly clear skin. You went home, you mixed up your lead, and you painted yourself white. It became the gold standard for beauty. If you weren't wearing the mask, you weren't in the inner circle. You were a nobody. You were a peasant. This wasn't just a trend that came and went in a summer. It became the law of fashion. If you wanted to climb the social ladder, you had to poison yourself. People watched Elizabeth like hawks. They noticed every little change she made. If she started wearing her hair a certain way to hide a receding hairline, then every woman in London started wearing wigs. If she wore a certain collar, everyone wore that collar. But the white face was the big one. It was the one thing you couldn't skip. She was the first person to prove that if you're famous enough, people will follow you right off a cliff. They didn't care that their skin was turning gray or that they were getting constant headaches. They didn't care that their breath started to smell like rot because the lead was decaying their gums.
They were looking at the Queen, they were looking at the mask, and they decided that the risk was worth the reward. They chose to rot from the inside out just so they could look like they belonged in the room. Imagine being at a party and everyone is wearing a literal mask of poison. You can't see their real skin. You can't see them blush or get pale. You just see this wall of white lead. It created this weird fake reality where everyone looked the same. It was a total domino effect. Elizabeth turned her own personal tragedy into a fashion requirement for an entire continent. She made it so that being beautiful and being healthy were two completely different things. You couldn't have both. And most people, they chose the beauty. They chose the lead. They looked at the Queen and thought, if she can do it and stay on the throne, I can do it to get a husband or a job at court. It was a classic case of monkey see, monkey do, but with a lethal twist that no one wanted to talk about. The Queen had spoken without saying a word, and the rest of the world was ready to die to keep up with her. So the Queen sets the trend, and suddenly every woman in Europe looks in the mirror and thinks one thing: my forehead is way too small. I'm not joking. Back then, having a massive forehead was the ultimate flex. If you had a low hairline that sat close to your eyebrows, people didn't just think you were out of style. They thought you were dim-witted. They thought you looked like a peasant, or even worse, an animal. It was the it look of the Renaissance, and if you weren't born with a forehead that looked like an egg, you had to make one. This wasn't just about moving a few stray hairs, either. I'm talking about moving your entire hairline back by an inch or more. Think about where your hair starts right now. Now imagine grabbing a pair of tweezers and pulling out every single hair until your forehead starts halfway up the top of your skull. That is exactly what these women did. They wanted that perfectly smooth, rounded look. They wanted to look like they had so much brain power that their hair just couldn't stay on their heads. But, as you can probably guess, plucking your entire scalp with tweezers takes forever. It's slow, it's tedious, and it hurts like crazy. So they found ways to speed things up. If you were a woman in the 1500s and you wanted to get that high-fashion look quickly, you had a few pretty terrifying options. First, there were the rough stones. They would take a piece of pumice or a jagged rock and literally sand their foreheads down. They would rub and rub until the hair was gone. Of course, the hair isn't the only thing that goes when you do that. You're also rubbing off layers of skin. You're left with a raw, bleeding mess where your hair used to be. If the stones didn't appeal to you, you could go the chemical route. And I use the word chemical very loosely here. We're talking about home-brewed mixtures that would make a modern doctor faint. One of the most popular recipes for hair removal involved mixing strong vinegar with, get this, cat poop. They would mix it into a paste and smear it across their hairlines. The goal was to create a chemical burn. The acid in the vinegar and the ammonia in the waste would eventually eat away at the hair follicles. They'd leave this stuff sitting on their skin, stinging and burning until the hair just gave up and fell out. Sometimes they used quicklime, too, which is the same stuff people use to decompose bodies. It worked, but it didn't just take the hair. It left the skin blistered and scarred. And they didn't stop at the hairline. If you really wanted to nail the look, you had to get rid of your eyebrows, too. To them, eyebrows were just clutter. They got in the way of that big, smooth, intelligent forehead. So they plucked them until there wasn't a single hair left. Or they burned them off with the same cat poop and vinegar cocktail. When they were done, their faces looked totally different. Imagine a face with no eyebrows and a hairline that starts at the crown of the head. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie to us, but to them, it was the height of elegance. Now, I want you to really think about what these women looked like after a beauty session. They didn't just walk away looking like a painting. They walked away with foreheads that were bright red, swollen, and probably oozing a little bit. Their skin was angry. It was raw from the plucking, and it was chemically burned from the pastes. They had literal wounds on their faces in the name of looking smart. But they couldn't just walk around with a giant, scabby red forehead. That would ruin the whole "I'm a sophisticated noble" vibe. So they had to hide the damage. This is where things went from bad to worse. To cover up the redness and the sores, they turned to the one thing they thought solved everything: thick, white makeup. They would take a paste made of white lead and slather it over the raw skin. Think about that for a second. You have a fresh chemical burn on your forehead, and your solution is to rub lead directly into the open wound. You're basically inviting the poison into your bloodstream. But in their minds, they didn't have a choice. The queen had the look. The smart people had the look. If you wanted to be anyone who mattered, you had to have that forehead, no matter how much it burned, and no matter what you had to rub into your skin to hide the pain. They were literally stripping their bodies apart, hair by hair, just to fit a trend that was killing them from the outside in. So you've just spent your morning rubbing lead on your face and pulling out your hairline with a pair of tweezers. You're exhausted, your skin is raw, and you're probably feeling pretty miserable. But you can't stop there. If you really want to climb the social ladder in the Renaissance, the next thing you have to ruin is your mouth. And it all started because of a massive craving for something we take for granted today: sugar. Back then, sugar wasn't sitting in a bowl on every kitchen table. It was brand new, and it was coming in on ships from the colonies. Because it had to be shipped across the ocean, the price was sky high. If you were a regular person, you might go your whole life without tasting it. But if you were rich, you put sugar on absolutely everything. You didn't just put it in your tea, you put it on your meat. You put it in your wine. You even had your cooks bake giant, elaborate sculptures made of solid sugar, just so your guests could break off a piece and eat it after dinner. It was the ultimate way to flex your bank account. But here is the problem. These people didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't have fluoride. They were eating pure sugar by the spoonful and then just letting it sit there. You can guess what happened next. Their teeth didn't just get a few cavities, they rotted. They turned brown, then gray, and eventually they turned jet black. Their breath probably smelled like a trash can in the middle of July. Now, in any other time period, having a mouthful of rotten, black stumps would be a nightmare. But the Renaissance was weird. Because sugar was so expensive, having those black teeth became a status symbol. It was proof that you were so wealthy you could afford to rot your own mouth out. It's like how some people today wear expensive shoes that are impossible to walk in. The pain and the damage were the whole point. It showed you had money to burn. This trend went all the way to the top. Queen Elizabeth I was famous for it. She had such a massive sweet tooth that by the time she was older, her teeth were described as being as black as coal. When she talked, people could barely understand her because she was missing so many teeth, and the ones she had left were falling out. But since she was the queen, she was the ultimate fashion icon. If the queen had black teeth, then black teeth were the coolest thing you could possibly have. This is where it gets truly desperate. If you were part of the middle class, you wanted to look like you were part of that inner circle. You wanted people to think you were eating sugar at every meal, even if you were actually struggling to pay rent. But since you couldn't afford the actual sugar to rot your teeth naturally, you had to fake it. People would actually take black soot from their fireplaces or buy dark makeup and paint their healthy white teeth black. Imagine that for a second. You get up in the morning, look in the mirror, and think, my teeth look way too healthy. Then you take a brush and darken them up just so you can go to a party and pretend you have a mouthful of expensive Decay. It was the original fake it till you make it, just way more disgusting.
Of course, not everyone wanted to look like a rotting corpse. There were people who actually tried to keep their teeth white. But since they didn't have real dentists, they went to the local barber or a traveling salesman for help. And the cures these guys offered were way worse than the rot. First, they'd use mechanical tools. I'm not talking about soft bristles. I'm talking about rough metal files. They would literally sit you down and file away the surface of your teeth to scrape off the stains and the plaque. It was loud, it was painful, and it stripped away the enamel, that hard outer layer that actually protects your teeth. If the filing didn't work, they brought out the chemicals. The most popular choice was something called aquafortis. That sounds fancy, but it's really just a very strong nitric acid. They would soak a cloth in this acid and rub it directly onto your teeth. Now think about what acid does. It eats through metal. It eats through bone. When they rubbed it on their teeth, it definitely made them look white for a minute, because it was literally melting off the top layer of the tooth. But once that protection was gone, the teeth were wide open to every germ and bacteria in the city. The acid would seep into the gums and the roots. Within weeks, the teeth would become brittle and start to crumble. They would get massive infections that turned their gums purple and caused their faces to swell up. Eventually, the teeth would just fall out of their heads entirely. So you had a whole society of people making a choice. You either painted your teeth black to look rich, or you used acid to turn them white until they fell out. Either way, by the time you hit 30, you were probably eating nothing but soup because you didn't have anything left to chew with. They were so obsessed with the look of wealth and health that they ended up destroying the very things they were trying to show off. And the worst part? This wasn't some secret. Everyone knew it hurt. Everyone saw their friends' teeth falling out. But the pressure to fit in was so strong that they just kept scrubbing, filing, and painting until there was nothing left but a painful, empty smile.
So you've got a painful, empty smile, and you're probably thinking it couldn't get much worse. But in the Renaissance, the pressure to be beautiful didn't stop at your teeth. It went all the way to the top of your head. If you were a woman back then, you didn't just want to be pretty. You wanted to be a golden goddess. You wanted what they called Venetian blonde. It wasn't just a trend. It was an obsession. I'm not talking about a subtle highlight either. I'm talking about a bright, shimmering gold that shouted to everyone that you had the time and money to look like a literal painting. Getting that color wasn't as easy as buying a box of dye at the store. It was a whole ordeal that took hours or even days. If you walked through a city like Venice in the 1500s and looked up at the roofs of the houses, you'd see something really strange. You'd see dozens of women sitting on wooden platforms called altane. They weren't just up there to catch a breeze or look at the view. They were essentially cooking themselves. They had these special hats called solanas. Imagine a straw hat with a massive wide brim, but someone cut the entire top out of it so it's just a ring. They would pull their hair through that hole and spread it out across the brim. This kept their faces in the shade, because a tan was for peasants who worked in the fields, but it left their hair completely exposed to the direct sunlight. They'd sit there for hours, sometimes all day, just waiting for the sun to bleach their hair. But the sun wasn't doing all the work by itself. To speed things up, they used some truly nasty mixtures. They'd take a sponge on a stick and keep dabbing their hair with these homemade bleaches they'd mixed up in the kitchen. Now, some of the stuff they used was bad enough, like alum or sulfur. Those chemicals can fry your skin and make your hair so brittle that it just snaps off like a dry twig. But the secret ingredient they really swore by, that was human urine. They believed the older the pee, the better it worked. And they weren't totally wrong about the science. Urine contains ammonia, which is still a huge ingredient in hair dye today because it opens up the hair to let the color change. But back then, they didn't have a lab to clean it up. They just used the real thing. So picture these women sitting on a hot roof in the middle of an Italian summer, covered in old pee and sulfur for 6 or 7 hours straight. The smell must have been unbelievable. Their hair would end up looking golden, sure, but it was also damaged, dry, and probably smelled like a stable. Now, you'd think that after a long day of baking in urine and chemicals, the first thing they'd do is jump into a hot bath. But you'd be wrong. In the Renaissance, people were actually terrified of water. They didn't think of a bath as a way to get clean. They thought of it as a death trap. Doctors at the time told everyone that hot water was dangerous because it opened up your pores. They believed that if your pores were open, your body was like a house with the front door left wide open. It let in bad air, which they thought carried diseases like the plague right into your internal organs. So they avoided water like it was poison. They might splash a little on their face or hands if they had to, but a full body soak was almost unheard of for years at a time. Instead of washing the sweat and the dirt off with water, they used what they called dry washing. They'd take a piece of rough linen cloth and just rub it over their skin as hard as they could. They thought that by scrubbing away the surface dirt and oils, they were staying healthy. If they were rich, they might change their white linen undershirts a few times a day. As long as the shirt looked white and clean, they convinced themselves that the body underneath was clean too. But beneath those layers of silk and velvet, their skin was actually caked in layers of dead skin, old sweat, and those hair chemicals. You can probably guess the result of all this. Everyone smelled. Not just a little bit, but a lot. Between the unwashed bodies and the weird hair treatments, the air in a crowded room would have been thick enough to choke you. To deal with the stench, they didn't reach for deodorant. They used pomanders. A pomander was basically a little ball made of gold or silver that hung from a chain at your waist or neck. Inside, they stuffed a mixture of really strong-smelling spices and animal fats. I'm talking about things like musk, cinnamon, and cloves. It was like a portable air freshener you carried everywhere. When the smell of the people around you, or the smell of your own unwashed skin got too much to handle, you'd just lift the pomander to your nose and take a deep breath. It didn't make you clean, but it made the world a little more bearable. They were basically walking around in a cloud of perfume to hide the fact that their beauty routine was making them rot from the outside in. So you have your perfume and your scented gloves to hide the smell of the rot, but you still have a major problem. You look like a mess. Your skin is covered in scars from smallpox, or maybe it's just rough from the sun and the grime of living in a city that's basically an open sewer. You need a fix. You need something that doesn't just sit on your skin, but actually changes how the world sees you. And that is where the real killer of the Renaissance enters the room. We call it Venetian ceruse. Back then, they had a much cooler and much scarier name for it: spirits of Saturn. If that sounds like something you would find in an old alchemist's basement next to a pile of skulls, that's because it basically was. This stuff was the holy grail of makeup, the absolute gold standard for beauty. But it was also a slow-motion suicide note. Now, let's talk about what was actually in this stuff. It wasn't some secret herbal blend or a rare flower from the mountains. It was lead. Pure, heavy, toxic white lead. And they didn't just rub a piece of metal on their faces. They had a whole process to turn it into something you could actually wear. They would take these thin strips of lead and put them in a jar with some high-quality vinegar. Then they would seal it up and let it sit. Over time, a chemical reaction happens. The acid in the vinegar starts eating at the lead. A white, crusty powder starts to grow on the surface of the metal. They would go back into these jars, scrape that white crust off, and grind it down until it was a superfine powder. They'd mix that powder with a little bit of water, or sometimes more vinegar, and maybe some egg whites to give it a little bit of a shine. You might wonder why on earth anyone would put lead on their face. The thing is, this stuff worked better than anything we have in a makeup aisle today. If you have a deep scar or a pockmark, you want it gone. Modern foundation is thin and runny. Venetian ceruse was thick. It was like spackle for your skin. It was literally like drywalling your face. You would smear it on, and it would fill every single hole, every wrinkle, and every crevice. It gave you this perfectly smooth porcelain look that didn't move. It was bright white, which was the ultimate goal. See, in the Renaissance, white skin meant everything. It meant you were rich. It meant you didn't have to spend your days working outside in the sun like a peasant. You were a person of leisure. So women didn't just put a little bit on, they piled it on. They created a mask that was so heavy they could barely move their faces without it cracking like an old wall. But to them, it was worth it. They looked like statues. They looked perfect. But here is the catch. Your skin is a living organ, and it's not meant to be covered in heavy metal. Almost immediately, things would start to go wrong. You put the ceruse on to hide a blemish, but the lead would actually cause more blemishes. It's a vicious cycle that you can't win. The lead would dry out your skin until it started to flake and peel. You would get these weird scaly patches that no amount of lotion could fix. And then the color would start to change. The lead would react with your skin and turn it a dull, sickly gray. Think about that for a second. You're using this stuff to look white and pure, but it's actually turning your flesh gray and dead. So what did they do? Did they stop? No. They just put on a thicker layer of white lead to hide the gray skin that the lead had caused in the first place. They were burying their faces under layers of poison just to look like the person they used to be. It didn't stop at the skin either. This stuff was soaking into your pores and getting right into your bloodstream. People started getting these insane stomach cramps that felt like someone was twisting a hot knife in their gut. They called it lead colic. Your breath would start to smell like old rusted metal. Your gums would turn black or a weird shade of blue. You'd feel tired all the time. Your head would throb, and your hair would start to fall out at the temples. You were literally falling apart. But if you were a lady at court, you didn't blame the makeup. You didn't even think about the white jar on your vanity. You blamed your diet, or you blamed the bad air, or you blamed your humors being out of balance. You just touched up your white mask, put on your wig, and went back out to the party. This wasn't some niche product for people who didn't know better. This was the most popular makeup in the Western world for hundreds of years. Every famous portrait you see from that era, every queen with that ghostly white face, that's Venetian ceruse you're looking at. Queen Elizabeth I was basically the poster child for it. She used so much of it as she got older that people said her face looked like a painted wall. She couldn't even wash it off because her skin underneath was so damaged and gray that she looked like a corpse, so she just kept adding more. The craziest part is that they knew lead was dangerous. Doctors back then were already writing about how lead was bad news. They knew it made you sick. They knew it made your hair fall out. But nobody cared. The pressure to look perfect and stay white was stronger than the fear of a slow, painful death. You wanted that spirits of Saturn glow, even if Saturn was slowly killing you from the inside out. You were willing to rot as long as you looked like a diamond while you did it. It was the ultimate trade-off, and for centuries, almost everyone was willing to make it. They were literally dying to look good, and they did it with a smile on their face, even if that smile was painted on a layer of poison. So you've got this layer of poison on your face, and you're walking around the palace feeling like $1,000,000. You look like a statue. You're pale, you're smooth, and every guy in the room is looking at you. But here's the thing about lead. It doesn't just sit on your skin like a nice piece of clothing. It's aggressive. It's a metal, and it wants to settle in. From the second you pat that white paste onto your cheeks, the clock starts ticking on your actual face. I want you to think about what happens when you leave a piece of fruit out on the counter. At first, it's fine, but then the air and the chemicals start working on it. It shrivels, it loses its moisture. That is exactly what this makeup was doing to these women. It's called the cycle of rot. And once you start, you really can't stop. It's a trap that you build for yourself, one layer at a time. Here is how the cycle works. You put the makeup on in the morning. It feels cold and heavy. As the day goes on, that lead starts to suck the natural oils right out of your pores. Lead is incredibly thirsty. It dehydrates your skin on a level that regular soap or sun never could. By the time the sun goes down, the skin underneath that white mask is starting to gasp. It's getting tight. It's getting dry. Now, in a normal world, you'd wash that off and put on some lotion, right? But these women didn't do that. For one thing, they didn't have the kind of moisturizers we have now. And for another, they were terrified of what they'd see in the mirror. Because when that lead dries out your skin, it doesn't just make it flaky, it makes it crack. Imagine your face as like a mud puddle in a drought. As the moisture leaves, the ground starts to split. Deep, jagged lines start forming around your mouth and your eyes. And because lead is literally killing the cells it touches, those cracks don't just go away. The skin starts to die. It turns a weird, sickly yellow, and then it starts to turn gray. It looks like the skin of someone who has been dead for a few days, even though they're still standing there laughing and dancing. So you wake up the next morning, you look in the mirror, and you see these new cracks. You see the gray spots. You see the places where your skin is literally starting to rot away. What do? You can't go out like that. You'd be a social outcast. So you grab your jar of Venetian ceruse, that's the fancy name for the lead poison, and you do the only thing you can think of. You put on a thicker layer. You use the makeup to fill in the cracks that the makeup created. You're using the fire to try and put out the fire. It works for a few hours. The new layer covers the rot. It fills in the holes. You look smooth again. But underneath that fresh white paint, the lead is just digging deeper. It's eating further into your cheeks. It's making the holes bigger. And here is the really gross part. A lot of these women didn't wash this stuff off for days. I'm talking about a full week. Think about that. You've got a thick, heavy shell of lead, sweat, dirt, and dead skin all mashed together on your face. You sleep in it. You wake up. You see a bit of it flaked off on your pillow, and you just patch the hole with more lead. You're wearing a mask that is slowly becoming part of your head. It's not just makeup anymore. It's a crust. It's a scab that covers your entire face. By day 4 or 5, the smell must have been something else. You've got rotting skin trapped under a layer of metal. But you keep going. You keep adding more. You're stuck in this loop where the worse your skin looks, the more poison you have to apply to hide it. It's a race you're never going to win. Your skin is dying in real time, and you're just painting over the corpse. Eventually, though, you have to take it off. Maybe you have a big event coming up and you want a fresh start. Or maybe the layers have just gotten too heavy and they're starting to peel off in chunks like old house paint. So you get some vinegar or some wine, because that's what they used back then to break down the grease, and you start scrubbing. This is the moment of truth. This is the reveal. And I'm telling you, it was a horror show. When that final layer of white gunk comes off, the woman in the mirror is a stranger. Her skin isn't soft or pink or healthy. It's gray. It's the color of a tombstone. It's shriveled up like an old apple that's been sitting in the back of the fridge for 6 months. There are deep pits in her cheeks where the lead literally ate the flesh away. The skin is hanging loose because the lead destroyed the elasticity. It's dying. She looks 20 years older than she did a week ago. Her face is a map of chemical burns and rot. You'd think this would be the moment she throws the jar away and screams for help. You'd think she'd realize that the beauty isn't worth the price. But that's the tragedy of the whole thing. She looks at that gray, dying face in the mirror, and she feels more naked and ashamed than ever. She feels hideous. She feels like she's lost her power. And so, with trembling hands, she reaches for the jar. She scoops out a big glob of the white poison, and she starts the whole process all over again. She paints the mask back on. She covers the rot. She chooses the poison, because at this point, the truth is just too ugly to face. She's locked in the cycle, and the only way out is when the lead finally finishes the job and kills her for good.
So even with the lead basically eating her alive, she's still not done. She's already poisoned her skin, but now she's looking in the mirror and thinking about her eyes. See, back then, having clear skin wasn't enough. You had to have the right look in your eyes, too. And that brings us to the next nightmare in the Renaissance makeup kit. It involves a plant called belladonna, but everyone else just called it deadly nightshade. And let me tell you, it earned that name for a reason. Think about how you use eye drops today. Maybe you've got allergies or you're tired, so you put in a little saline to clear things up. Now imagine doing that with a liquid made from one of the most toxic plants on Earth. These women would take the juice from the berries of the nightshade plant, get a tiny glass dropper, tilt their heads back, and squeeze that poison directly onto their eyeballs. It wasn't a one-time thing either. They did this every single day as part of their morning routine. Just like you'd put on your shoes or grab your keys, they were dosing themselves with a chemical that could stop a heart. Why would anyone do that? Well, it all comes down to the pupils. They wanted those big, wide, black circles in the middle of their eyes. When your pupils are huge, it makes you look like you're interested in someone. It makes your eyes look soft and dreamy.
It's actually a biological trick. When we see someone we're attracted to, or even when we're just excited, our pupils naturally get bigger. So these women were trying to fake that I'm in love look all the time. They wanted to look like they were permanently staring at the most amazing person in the room, even if they were just looking at a wall. But here's the thing about your pupils that these women didn't want to admit. They aren't just there for decoration. They're there to control how much light gets into your head. They're like the shutters on a window. When it's bright out, the shutters close so you don't get blinded. When you use belladonna, you're basically paralyzing the muscles that make those shutters work. The poison keeps the windows locked wide open. Imagine walking outside on a bright sunny afternoon in Italy and your eyes can't adjust. It's like someone is shining a high-powered flashlight directly into your brain. Everything is way too bright. It's painful. It's physically exhausting. You're standing there trying to look beautiful and soft, but inside, your brain is screaming because it's getting hit with 10 times more light than it can handle. It didn't stop with the light, though. Since your eyes can't focus, your vision starts to go. Imagine being at a fancy dinner party or a royal ball. You're wearing the best clothes, your skin is painted white with lead, and your eyes are these huge dark voids. But you can't even see the person standing 3 feet in front of you. You're just looking at a big fuzzy shape. You're trying to act sophisticated, but you're tripping over rugs and missing your cup when you reach for your wine. You're basically stumbling around in a thick fog just to keep up appearances. They see those big pupils and think you're deep and mysterious, but the reality is that you're just legally blind in that moment. You can't see the food on your plate. You can't see the stairs. You are a prisoner of your own face.
Now, if you keep doing this day after day, and trust me, they did, the damage doesn't just go away when you go to sleep. The poison builds up in your system. It starts to mess with your heart rate. It makes your heart skip beats or race like you're running a marathon while you're just sitting in a chair. Your throat gets so dry you can barely swallow. You start to get confused. You might even start seeing things that aren't there. And finally, the light just goes out. The plant finishes what it started. You go completely, permanently blind. You spent years trying to make your eyes look perfect for everyone else, and now you can't even see what you look like in the mirror. You can't see the sun. You can't see your kids. You traded your entire world just to have big pupils for a few hours a day. It's a wild trade-off, isn't it? You choose a few years of looking soft and attractive over a lifetime of actually being able to see. You're literally trading your sight for a look. You want to look like you're in love, so you use a poison that ensures you'll never see the person you're supposed to be in love with ever again. It's the ultimate irony. You're standing there, looking like a goddess with these deep, dark eyes, but you're effectively a statue. You can't read, you can't walk alone, and you can't see the world you worked so hard to impress. But in the Renaissance, that was just the price of doing business. If the fashion said you needed big eyes, you got big eyes, even if it meant you'd never see another sunset. They knew it was poison. They knew it caused blindness. They even knew it could kill them if they used too much. But the mirror is a powerful thing, and back then, a beautiful corpse was often seen as better than an ugly living woman. So they kept the drops coming, one stinging squeeze at a time, until the world went dark.
Going blind was just the start of the price you paid. If you could still see your reflection, chances are you didn't like what was looking back at you. Your skin was the next thing on the chopping block. You have to understand that back then, having clear, pale skin wasn't just about being pretty. The biggest problem anyone faced back then was syphilis. It was everywhere. It spread through the cities like wildfire, and it didn't care if you were a princess or a peasant. If you caught it, it didn't just stay inside your body. It crawled up to your face and left these horrible, crusty red patches all over your skin. It was like wearing a sign that told everyone exactly what you'd been doing in your spare time. It was a social death sentence. You couldn't hide it with a bit of powder. You had to get rid of the skin itself. So you turned to mercury. Today, we know mercury is one of the most dangerous things you can touch. We have hazmat suits for that stuff. But back then, it was the miracle cure. They called it quicksilver, and they treated it like a magic eraser for the face. You'd take this heavy silver liquid and mix it into a paste. Sometimes they'd add a bit of lead or some pig fat to make it spread easier. Then you'd sit in front of your mirror and rub it right into those red patches. You'd rub it into your forehead, your cheeks, and your neck. I want you to imagine what that felt like. It didn't just sit on top of your skin. Mercury is heavy. It sinks in. At first, it might have felt cool, but pretty soon it started to itch. Then it started to burn. That was the point. You weren't trying to moisturize. You were trying to trigger a chemical reaction. You were essentially giving yourself a high-grade chemical burn on purpose. After a few days of doing this, the mercury started to do its job. Your skin would turn a weird grayish color. It would get tight and shiny, and then it started to crack. This is the part where it gets really gross. Your skin didn't just flake off like a dry sunburn. It came off in sheets. You could literally grab a corner of your own skin and peel it away from your face like you were taking off a mask. Underneath, the skin was raw and pink. It looked fresh. Those syphilis patches were gone, at least for a little while. You had traded your old scarred skin for a brand new layer. But here's the thing about mercury. It doesn't just stay on your face. Once you rub it in, it enters your bloodstream. It travels through your veins and starts setting up camp in your organs. It heads straight for your brain and your nervous system. While you were busy looking in the mirror, admiring your new smooth forehead, the poison was busy dismantling you from the inside out. The first thing you'd notice was the smell. Your breath would start to stink like rotting meat. Your gums would get soft and turn a nasty shade of purple. They'd get so weak that they couldn't hold on to your teeth anymore. Suddenly, one of your front teeth is just sitting there on your tongue, then another. Before long, you're losing teeth left and right. Then your hair started to go. It wouldn't just thin out, it would come out in clumps. You'd wake up and find your pillow covered in hair. You'd brush your hand through your head and end up holding a handful of yourself. So now you've got this smooth, peeled skin, but you're bald and toothless. You're trading one kind of ugly for an even scarier one. But the worst part wasn't the teeth or the hair. That mercury was eating your nerves. Your hands would start to tremble. At first, it was just a little twitch in your fingers. You'd try to hold a wine glass, and it would rattle against your teeth, the ones you had left. But it got worse. Soon your whole arm would be jumping. You couldn't feed yourself. You couldn't dress yourself. You'd try to walk, and your legs would give out because your brain couldn't tell them what to do anymore. You were literally vibrating yourself to death. You'd get these mood swings where you'd be crying one minute and screaming the next because the mercury was messing with your head. People would think you were going crazy, but you were just poisoned. You were a walking chemistry experiment gone wrong. And why? Why would you do that to yourself? because the pressure to look perfect was that intense. You were trapped. If you kept the syphilis patches, you were an outcast. If you used the mercury, you were a ticking time bomb. Most women chose the bomb. They figured it was better to be a beautiful, shaking wreck than a healthy woman with a few spots on her face. They were trading their entire nervous systems for a few weeks of clear skin. They were burning off their faces to hide a disease, only to catch a different, much deadlier one from the bottle on their vanity. And the sad reality is, the cure was usually much faster. You'd end up with a face as smooth as a marble statue, but you'd be shaking so hard you couldn't even stand up to see it. It wasn't just a beauty routine, it was a slow-motion suicide, all in the name of looking good. So, you've got the look, you've got that perfect marble white skin we talked about, but your hands are shaking and you can barely keep your balance. That's where the dream of beauty starts to turn into a nightmare. It wasn't just a few people getting a little bit sick. It was a whole generation of the richest, most powerful people on earth basically poisoning themselves to death on purpose. Doctors back then were totally confused for a long time. They kept seeing these wealthy women and men just fading away. You'd see a duchess who was the star of every party one year, and 2 years later she couldn't even hold a wine glass without spilling it. Her skin would start to turn a weird, sickly gray color. Now, you'd think she would stop using the makeup then, right? But she didn't. She did the opposite. Because her skin looked gray and dead, she put on even more of that white lead powder to cover it up. It was a total disaster. Her hair would fall out in huge clumps, so she'd go out and buy a massive, heavy wig. Her breath would start to smell terrible because her gums were shrinking and her teeth were literally rotting in her mouth. But here's the wild part. Because everyone else in the high society circles wanted to look just like her, they didn't see a dying woman. They saw a fashion icon. They thought the pale, ghostly look was just the latest trend. They didn't realize they were looking at a walking corpse until it was too late. Eventually, the human body just gives up. Lead doesn't just sit on top of your skin like a piece of clothing. It seeps into your pores. It gets into your bloodstream. It travels to your brain, your kidneys, and your bones. And once it's in there, it stays. It builds up day after day. Every single morning when these people freshened up their face, they were adding another nail to their own coffin. We know this is true because we've actually checked. Modern scientists have gone into the old family crypts and churchyards to look at the remains of the Renaissance elite. They took samples from the bones of dukes and duchesses who died hundreds of years ago. What they found is honestly terrifying. The lead levels in those skeletons are off the charts. We are talking about levels that are hundreds of times higher than what we'd consider a total medical emergency today. If you walked into a hospital right now with that much lead in your system, the doctors would be panicking. They'd be calling in specialists. But for a Renaissance noble, that was just what it cost to look good for dinner. People weren't totally stupid, though. After a while, they started to notice a pattern. They saw that the women who used the thickest layers of ceruse, which was just a fancy name for that white lead paint, were the ones who died the youngest. They saw that the people who spent the most money on these cosmetics were the ones who lost their teeth by the time they were 25. Think about the trap they were in. If you didn't wear the makeup, you didn't fit in with the cool crowd. If you didn't fit in, you didn't get married or get invited to the palace. For a woman back then, her face was her career. It was her only way to have power. So the very thing she did to survive socially was the exact thing that was killing her physically. It was a deadly loop. You used the poison to hide the damage that the poison already did to you. The more your skin rotted, the more lead you needed to hide the rot. If you were a poor peasant working in a field, you were actually way safer. You couldn't afford the fancy white paint. You were out in the sun all day, getting a dark tan. It meant you had to work for a living, but that tan meant you were getting vitamin D, and you weren't rubbing heavy metals into your face every morning. The rich people looked down on the poor, but the poor were the ones who still had their real hair and their real teeth. Slowly, the truth started to come out. A few doctors began to speak up. They told people that they were literally painting death onto their skin. But it's hard to fight a trend when everyone you know is doing it. People wanted to be beautiful more than they wanted to be healthy. It's a story as old as time, but the Renaissance took it to a literal extreme. You'd walk into a royal ball and see a room full of people who looked like beautiful marble statues. They were white, they were still, and they looked perfect. But if you looked closer, you'd see the tremors in their hands. You'd see the wigs covering the bald spots. You'd hear the rattling in their chests. Beauty had become a literal cause of death, right up there with the plague or smallpox. The only difference was that this was a killer people paid for. They invited it into their homes. They put it on with a smile, and they died for it. It wasn't just a beauty routine anymore. It was a death sentence that the upper class handed to themselves. It's easy to look back at those people and think they were just being stupid. You hear about women painting their faces with literal poison, and you want to shake them. You want to ask them what they were thinking. But before we get too high and mighty, I want you to take a look in your own bathroom cabinet. I want you to think about what we do today. Because if you think we've stopped risking our lives to look good, you haven't been paying attention. We didn't actually get smarter. We just got better at chemistry. Think about Botox for a second. It's one of the most popular beauty treatments in the world. But do you know what it actually is? It's a toxin called botulinum. In the wild, it's one of the deadliest poisons on Earth. It's the stuff that causes botulism, which can paralyze your lungs and kill you in a matter of hours. But today, we pay a lot of money to have a doctor inject it right into our foreheads. We aren't doing it to get healthy. We're doing it to paralyze our face muscles so we can't make wrinkles. We're literally poisoning ourselves in tiny doses just so we don't look like we're getting older. It's the exact same trade those Renaissance women made. They wanted a smooth face, and they didn't care if the medicine was a killer. Then you've got the surgeries. I'm talking about things like the Brazilian butt lift. Doctors will tell you straight up that it is one of the most dangerous procedures you can get. They take fat from your stomach or your back, and they inject it into your backside. If they hit a vein by mistake, that fat goes straight to your heart or your lungs. It's called an embolism, and it can kill you before you even wake up from the anesthesia. People know this. They see the horror stories on the news, and they see the warnings on the consent forms, but they sign their names anyway. They get on the table, and they let someone cut them open, because they'd rather take a chance on dying than live with a body that doesn't fit the current trend. And don't even get me started on the pills. Back in the day, people used to eat arsenic to get that pale, sickly look that was so popular. Today, we have miracle weight loss drugs and sketchy supplements from the internet. We see a celebrity lose 30 pounds in a month, and we want whatever they're taking. We don't ask about the long-term side effects on our hearts or our kidneys. We don't care if it makes us feel like garbage every single day. We just want the results. We want to look like the people on our screens, and we're willing to use our own bodies as a laboratory to make it happen. The chemicals changed, but the story is exactly the same. We are still chasing a version of perfect that doesn't actually exist. So why do we do it? Why are we still so obsessed with looking a certain way that we'd risk our health for it? It's not because we're vain. It's because we're human. We are hardwired to want to belong. Hundreds of years ago, if you didn't look like the upper class, you were an outsider. You were poor, you were dirty, and you didn't matter. Today, if you don't fit the look of the moment, you feel invisible. You feel like you're failing.
We do these dangerous things because we're afraid of being left behind. We're afraid that if we don't fix our noses, or flatten our stomachs, or freeze our faces, we won't be loved or successful. That fear is a powerful drug. It's way more powerful than any warning label on a bottle of lead paint or a syringe of Botox. We want the group to accept us. We want to be seen as beautiful by the people around us. And for most of us, that feeling of belonging is worth any price. We like to think we're so much more advanced than the people who lived 500 years ago. We have science and safety regulations and better doctors. But when you strip all that away, we're still just those same people sitting in front of a mirror. We're still looking for a way to hide our flaws. We're still putting things into our bodies that don't belong there. Centuries from now, people are going to look back at us and they're going to laugh. They'll wonder how we could be so blind. They'll talk about the plastic we put in our chests and the poisons we put in our skin. They'll ask the same questions we ask about the Renaissance. But the answer won't change. We didn't do it because we were dumb. We did it because we wanted to be beautiful. And for a human being, sometimes that feels like a matter of life and death. That's the real toxic side of beauty. It's not the lead or the arsenic. It's the things we're willing to do to ourselves just to feel like we're enough. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time.